All right, everyone's starting to come in, so I want to welcome everyone to this session on Inventor Inequalities, Data versus Reality. And of course, you can already hear from the title, there's a little sense of provocation already in the title. So we're going to run this, so we're looking for an interesting discussion, and we're going to run this event for 45 minutes. And then we'll have time for some Q&A afterwards. But if you have comments or questions, go ahead and put it into the chat, and we'll pick this up as we go along. So it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, a good friend of mine, Kent Richardson. Kent is the CEO of Richardson Oliver Insights, a partner at RLL Group, as well as having an extensive experience in-house in several executive management positions. So Ken, thanks for being with us here today to moderate this session. I'm sure it's going to be a lively one. So over to you to introduce your panelists. Thanks, Ken.
Great, thanks. So welcome everybody. Super excited about this panel. We've got Mike Pellegrino. He is the official disturber in this one. He wrote the article that lit the world on fire around this stuff. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. Mike's president and founder of Pellegrino and Associates. Does a lot of valuation and strategy work. I'm not going to go into long descriptions of everybody, otherwise we'll burn through 3/4 of the panel session. So got Mike today, and then everybody else in the Coliseum. We've got Jay Yonamine from Google. Jay runs data science and ops and global patents for Google. So does a lot of data analytics and is heavily involved in the current area that we're talking about today. John Mulgrew, Chief Patent Counsel, Global Head of IP at Lenovo. John's had a number of jobs working heavily in data analytics to really push a lot of thinking around patents and what are important patents. He was at Microsoft and Uber before. And then we've got Julie Akhter. She's senior attorney at Microsoft. And she's been doing a lot of counseling the team around group IP and issues and analysis. And I'm just going to start from there and start with Mike. So you wrote a paper, kind of challenged a lot of people. For those who haven't seen the paper, it's an IAM paper entitled "Apple, Facebook, and Google Still Have Work to Do with Inventor Diversity." And you know, there's some pretty tough numbers in there. Mike, comments? Don't forget to unmute, Mike.
Thank you. It was actually part of a longer two-part series that we published with IAM. The first article came out the week before and looked at, it just set the framework for the specific company analysis that followed in the second piece. A lot of the roots of this came from some, it was almost an accidental thing I started working on last year because I saw something on LinkedIn. And for background, I own a massive patent data warehouse that I built from scratch, engineer, finance, accountant. And so I put my software skills to work on some of this. And I have about a 1/4 petabyte of patent data online. I pull about 2 terabytes a week. And post-process all that, most of it day zero, and includes most of everything that the USPTO publishes, but most importantly, the pair data sources. And so it gives me a visibility into the data that you don't get from a lot of other areas because it's just not an economically efficient thing to set up. But so we started with this data and looked at really understanding what was happening in the patent system from 3 different levels. Because there's 3 sets of primary actors in the patent data. You have the inventors, which are the folks that a lot of the discussion centered around today. But then we also have the examiners, and then we also have the patent prosecutors. All of them sign their names on documents that are rampant throughout the image file wrappers. And so what I started with was a view into the inventors, but that morphed very quickly into these other actors as well. So whenever you look at assigning responsibility or ownership or labeling, if you will, whether it's sex, gender, name of national origin, the starting issue that you have to deal with is where do you get the source for the names? And we did a lot of research on that. I have a research team that works for me in my consulting profession, and we spent a fair amount of time looking at the different sources that were out there. WIPO's got theirs, USPTO has theirs. In the end, we found a data source that we preferred because it tended to be the most extensive, but it also included a lot of analysis of names of national origin, and that became an essential part of the analysis that we performed. Importantly, because when there's this talk about equivalence of opportunity in the patent space, it tends to focus mostly on sex or gender normatives as opposed to national origin. And the data sources that we were working with provided us extensive country by country or name of national origin data as well. So it gave us a more robust view and allowed us to control for things that ordinarily you couldn't do with just the data sets based on gender alone. Specifically controlling for advancement in education at STEM level. Many of the folks that are in the data sets that we have will have names of foreign origin, but they'll also have extensive training in STEM. And so that gives us a very interesting way of contrasting whether it's just STEM education that is the gap or whether it broadens into other areas. So we looked at, there were around 30,000 different names that we had in that data source that we characterized. We went back and manually spot checked the first 1,000 names to make sure that there was nothing spurious in there. And then we ran these tests at the examiner level and looking at the just the contribution by name of national origin as well as by gender. And when we talk about gender, we're just going by the name given at birth, not necessarily how folks carry that name in their daily life. So there's a bias, if you will, already on that source, but it's same sort of issue that we heard in other programs today. And we looked at what the composition of the examiners was. And we found that today, USPTO is about 30% women, the balance men. There tends to be a preference for folks with English or biblical names. We speak a lot about this in the article. I'm not going to belabor it all today. So what we found, it was really interesting there, is the USPTO made a tangible progress in the change of their assignments for patent examiners, and it goes back about 25 years. And if you look at things on a percentage basis, corporate America is lagging the USPTO by 20, 25 years, just based on the same metrics. We then looked at the law firms. Now, the thing about law firms and examiners is that it's easier to control those two things because they tend to be a service provider on the examiner side and the prosecuting agent side, whereas innovation is something that might be more serendipitous. You can't train that, but you can take somebody with a particular background in law, for example, or in patent examining, and allocate them to different different research areas for different products or within the patent data. And what happens is that we looked at who was getting responsibility for assignments, those signing the application to issues, as well as who is actually making all the filings within PAIR. I can type in any attorney's reg number and have their name, and I can pull up everything they've ever filed. So it's very easy for me to understand with particular precision how companies are making a decision about where they assign the work. And of course, this, I think part of the inspiration of this was the Mansfield rule and a calculator that we developed to measure Mansfield performance. And you can see that there are differences in how law firms allocate the work. And some of that might tie to the relationship, who owns the client relationship, but also some of that is also tied to what might be norms within the firm, which are maybe not keeping up with what you would expect to see, particularly from AmLaw 100 firms, where you see a lot of emphasis on diversity on the first page of their website. So that's the second set of actors that we looked at. And then we took 3 companies. We took Apple, Facebook, and Google. We weren't picking on them. And the data is, I think folks made this point in the prior session. A lot of folks have similar issues. They just tend to trade in a very narrow band, but they all have similar issues in in many ways until you get to the small and medium business category, where you'll see a lot of breakout performance, some really stellar performers actually, depending on the science area. And we looked at how companies allocate patent resources based on gender and names of national origin. And we pulled data for 30 or 40 different companies from SEC filings, and we measured those, and we found, as I mentioned earlier, that in general, there's a consistency among the opportunity, and it's not just tied to gender, it's actually tied to national origin. This was particularly surprising for me in the tech companies, where you have a remarkable amount of engineers that have names of foreign origin to the US, not English or biblical names, and they were underrepresented by a significant margin relative to their contribution in the workforce. And this all has,
Hey, Mike, actually, just a quick one, sorry to interrupt you. Given that not everybody would have seen the paper, can you just give a couple numbers there to give some people some sense of that? I know we've heard numbers so far, but still it's helpful.
Sure. So it, 9–10% women participation. And we looked at something called an inventor slot, so how many inventors were on each patent. And for folks with English or biblical names, and those are easy to check, spot check, it's Michael, it's Matthew, Joseph, things like that. They tend to dominate, 85% of the names or more. In the patent prosecuting agent roster, you've got 45% women, 55% men, and yet women were signing only about 9%, 10% of the application data sheets. The USPTO, you're looking at 30% women participation. And you actually see pockets of brilliance too, based on name of national origin. Vietnam, for example, has remarkable presence in the US examiner pool. The last point I'll make, and then I'm going to hand it over to the other esteemed folks on the panel here, is that this actually drives economic consequences and pay disparities within the labor force. Many companies, and this, I experienced this myself when I used to be an inventor doing work with folks in the Fortune 100 or 1000, is that you get an incentive for being a named inventor. And if you look at, and I think I used a couple of different examples for Apple, Google, and Facebook about what the pay disparities would be for the top supported inventors versus the smallest ones. And you actually see rather dramatic differences in pay outcomes, because if, let's say it's $1,000 a patent bonus, and somebody is a named inventor on 50 patents a year, you're looking at a 50K difference. If your average salary is 200 grand, you've got a 25% difference in pay just based on how you support your inventors. And these are, like I say, just scratching the surface. I think my contact info is here. We're happy to get you the articles and whatnot if you want to take a much deeper dive. But I've shall we say, started out. Now I'd like to hand it over to the rest on the panel to clean up the mess I've made, shall we say.
Yeah. So Julie, I think you had a general comment on like, this is a problem for Basin. We kind of know a little bit about it from everywhere. Thoughts?
Yeah, so Microsoft was not in the article, but when it came out, it was still one of those things where he said, hey, look at this, this isn't a Microsoft problem. We were talking about it internally, we were looking at the numbers. It's not an Apple, Google, Facebook problem either. It's an everyone problem. And I mean, I think what really highlighted that was the USPTO's progress and potential report that came out in 2019, they updated in 2020, that highlighted those top filers, and there's the whole list, and you can see it's really, particularly in the software industry, it's everyone. And the session I went to earlier, she had the same, breakdown, and you could see the biotech firms at the top are doing better, and but the rest of us are not at parity. We're not matching what our engineering workforces look like. We're not, there's a gap. There's a gap between where we are with engineering and where we are with inventors. And it's pretty clear from the numbers, 50% of the US workforce is women, 20% of tech jobs are held by women, but only 11% of our patent inventors are women. And so, and that's true not just for women, but for African Americans, Hispanics, all across the different national origin, like Mike was talking about. And so this is an issue that we are all facing. And so for me particularly, having Mike's article come out was really helpful because it was, we were able to take that and go back and say, hey, look, this is something that we can't control. It's out there. People are writing articles, people are looking at public data, and they're running reports. And so it really helped move the conversation along for making progress on raising the awareness of the issue internally.
Jay, thoughts on Google's perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, largely, I think in line with Julie's comments. I guess first of all, any attention that this issue is receiving, I think is good, and it leads to sessions like this. It leads to internal conversations within our companies, and it leads to people asking sort of the next wave of questions, which I think often come down to like what can be done, what should be done, and where to start. I think especially some of the bigger organizations, it's tough. We're well over 100,000 people, and there's limited time in the day and limited resources and sort of ability to affect change at that scale right away. And so I think there's lots of questions around, well, what should we do first? And then maybe that comes down to focusing on specific product areas or specific departments, and then questions around how do we scale these types of programs effectively? What are the most effective types of programs? Doing benchmarking with other companies. Say, hey, where have you gained traction? Where have you made progress? And then tying a lot of this back to the actual data, right? And I think it's so important to balance our people's sort of individual experiences with issues and bias and sort of problematic sort of workplace dynamics that they may face, but also not losing sight of the sort of averages across the organization, and both are super important. And so we've been spending a lot of time trying to figure out and look into, well, what's the right way to measure this challenge, not just so we can understand the degree of the problem and where there may be concentrations, but also so we can start to track if these programs that we're rolling out are moving the needle. And if they are, can we scale them? And if they're not, can we adjust them? And so that's all to say, I think all these efforts are positive, and really impacting the change that everyone wants is tricky. And it requires sort of threading the needle between sort of using data in a rigorous way, but also sort of making sure that we're accounting for and listening to sort of people's individual human experiences.
So actually, Jay, and this is a little bit off the agenda. You said looking at measuring. What have you found in trying to measure this that is, you ran into like, well, that measurement doesn't really work the way we thought it would?
Yeah, I think, maybe two things. And first and foremost, I think what's super important is to understand the different composition of your actual sort of inventor community. Because you can imagine, an easy hypothetical is imagine two eng departments. At Google, the primary inventor community are our engineers. And imagine two departments of 1,000 engineers, but maybe one department is 50-50 split across an important distinction. And maybe that's sort of a sort of self-identified gender affiliation or ethnic affiliation or sort of veteran, non-veteran. And the actual inventorship rates are maybe 70-30 in one direction or 80-20. You're pretty sure that there is something going on there that's not just based on sort of average variation. But if you take another department that's maybe 1,000 engineers and your participation in the patent system is 80-20, but maybe that break, instead of being 50-50, actually is 80-20, that tells you something very different. That may tell you that you have a hiring problem, a retention problem, a recruitment problem, but the actual sort of likelihood of participating in the innovation process actually may be fairly consistent across all the groups of interest. And so that's just, I think, one example why it's so important to understand what the numerator and the denominator when you're looking at participation in innovation. I think something else that's a little more subtle too is important to note, and something that we talk about a lot internally, is that not every department, not every team, not every manager thinks about patents the same way. There may be some teams where patents are, or filing patents or innovation actually isn't core to their day-to-day business model. It's not going to help the promotion. It's not going to help retention. It's not going to help the bonus pool. And being cognizant of not there's no single one solution where you're not trying to push file patent on every team. In some instances, it might actually be against what's in their career growth best interests. And so really taking that, I guess that's all to say, a nuanced approach to this, I think, when you get down to the team level, becomes really, really critical.
John, Lenovo, what you guys, how you think about this problem, and where are you going with it?
Yeah, I actually was also really happy to see Mike's report. I think it's there are like different levels of reluctance for people to look at this issue. One is just a threshold of, well, if I look at the information, I might not get good news. And I would say that most of us are going to go through that experience. We're going to learn about where we are. I don't like characterizing it as a threat, like if you don't do it, someone else will. It's kind of it's an unnecessary thing. But there is this a psychological hurdle. Companies don't want to look because they don't know what they're going to get, and they think it's going to be bad news. They have a hunch, and they feel like they'll somehow be at the bottom of the curve. So I do think, in many respects, the report was really helpful for people to see that there is some truth in that the data is there. It's not super, like the capability to analyze not only where you stand, but where your competitors stand. Super easy to do. So there is some truth in, like, it's kind of important for you to understand where you are and figure out whether you want to do anything about this. So I liked it for that reason. There's some concerns I had with the report. I think it drew conclusions that were too simplistic. I think, for example, saying there's a pay disparity, I think it's a very complicated issue. Not every company actually compensates inventors for inventing. At Uber, there is no compensation, so there's no pay disparity whatsoever. A lot of companies think about inventorship as it's something outside of their job, not part of their job. It's on top of what they do. So there's additional incentive. It's very transactional in nature. Everyone has equal opportunity to do it. So I think there's a nuance there that was lost in the conclusions. I thought that the way you compare the USPTO success in hiring people and then comparing that to the inventorship rates for companies was wrong. I think it would have been better to say, how is Google hiring? How's the PTO hiring? I think you see similar performance. And then lastly, I think with the Mansfield rule, and I worked at a law firm after the Mansfield rule was enacted. I also worked in law firms before the Mansfield rule was enacted. Looking at who signed those filings doesn't tell you much. So it is weird that there are very few women signing the application form. But what I've found is there's a lot going on with who's actually doing the work and who's signing the papers that is complex. And I actually don't know if we know much about anything about law firms by looking at the filing papers. I think there's a lot more to look at beyond that. So that's kind of my reaction is mixed bag. I actually like it a lot that the paper came out, so thank you for doing it. I think the conclusions you drew underestimate the complexity of the problem. And so, like I said, I also worry that some of the conclusions might make people worry about getting involved because they'll feel like there'll be some pay disparity claim made against them. And I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Well, I mean, one of the things actually about the paper that I think I was surprised when I spoke to the panelists is what you just said, John, about being thankful for having something to sort of start a conversation with. And Julie, I think you articulated this really well. Want you to comment on that?
Comment on having a place to start the conversation?
Trying to get HR paid.
Yeah, okay, yeah, sorry. So, I mean, we've been talking about this internally at Microsoft for many years, and we've hit, roadblocks, really valid roadblocks about employee privacy and, can we actually affect meaningful change? If we're gonna have a metric and look at it and publish it, we wanna make sure it's something that we're really, we're able to affect it. And so we've hit roadblocks in the past, and I agree with John. John made a comment, we don't want to go there and be like, hey, we have to publish this or somebody else will. It doesn't need to be a threat. We work together, HR is our partner. Yep. We all want what's best for Microsoft or the company. And so when the paper came out, though, it was just another way to say, hey, this is something that's it was reassuring to be able to go to them and say, this is a metric that we can affect meaningful change. And we're not, John said, nobody wants to be the bottom of the curve. We're not the bottom of the curve. Microsoft is actually in a great position of being exactly at the national average, like right in the middle. So for us at Reese, it's like, hey, we're average. We should be a leader. We can be better. But, and by having the tools now come out and showing people are doing it, you can kind of address some of those privacy issues of saying, hey, we're aggregating the data. We want to make sure the inventor pool is large enough, which at Microsoft it is, to make it not easily identifiable what individuals are. Mike raised the issue earlier today too. This is just based on the name given to someone at birth, which, so you already have some errors in the data, but it's the best we can do without an opt-in, self-select what's your gender. But really, I think when we were talking to HR and the paper helped, catalyze the conversation was, is this a metric where we can affect meaningful change? Is there something we can do? And we were able to address that by educating and explaining to our partners what patent attorneys do, right? How we work with the business, how we can make changes. Jay brought up, sometimes you look at an organization and you say, okay, well, in this organization, which is 80-20 and it's 80-20, we're reaching out to all of these different communities and making efforts. And so we need to partner more closely with the business to increase the percentage of the underrepresented inventor community. Whereas another organization that's 50-50, there is something we can do. Like we can, and this pledge also, which is coming out tomorrow, like has a lot of great examples of things that we can do, reach out to those underrepresented communities and talk to them, set up mentorship programs, really make sure that they're aware of the patent process or find a different way to interact with them other than our current tools. And so I think getting people comfortable with what the metrics are and having some metrics to show and saying, this is an industry standard. This is something everyone's looking at. The USPTO is doing it. News articles are being published. These are things that we can really make a change with. Really helped ensure that all the stakeholders, from HR and legal and the business are on board and committed and understand what's going on.
Jay, thoughts on getting HR involved in this?
Yeah, it's difficult. I think anytime you're asking for that, data that is sort of within the sort of sensitive realm, it's a tough ask. And I think though that these types of things, the articles that I'm publishing, the USIPA diversity pledge, sessions like this, I think that generally will give HR more comfort to know that this isn't just Google digging around this. This isn't just Microsoft digging around this. This is 30 companies have pledged that they're going to work on these things, and then sharing best practices and saying, hey, these are the programs we rolled out. These are the successes we had. I think that will increasingly give, or hopefully increasingly give, HR departments comfort that this isn't sort of a risky behavior or a sort of unique type of ask. That this is actually industry standard, and that there are just expectations that these are things that the patents team should be stewards of, and it should be just part of the role of the department is to enact these programs, track, measure, and really make sure that we are moving the needle in ways that have lasting impact.
So John, you actually sort of built a process for trying to gather some of this data and information and broke the problem down. Any comments on your process for doing this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, I think this is, thanks, Ken. I think it's really important for, I really think that the data that we're talking about has a lot less of a privacy issue than it might first look like. We have, like, Mike is great because he collected what 1.5 what did you say, terabytes? It was a huge amount of data.
It's I pulled 2 terabytes a week, so I got about a petabyte and a half online with redundancy. But it's a lot of data.
So it's not super secret information that no one else is going to find out, right? So I think the important thing is, I think the data is not some sacred thing that you can sort of keep to yourself. That is not the paradigm that we're in. And I think the big challenge is understanding what's going on in your organization, as Jay was talking about. Like there's nuances there, and I think Julie was saying the same thing. So we look at the flow of how people start the process, like how, you know, what is our workforce. We sort of walled off the what we're looking at right now, because there's too many. You can look at even things like, are we recruiting at the right schools, and are we doing the right internships? Are we, you know, what are we doing all the way to get a diverse workforce? We've decided that, at least for now, we're going to draw the line at when someone decides to put forward a disclosure doc. We're going to compare the disclosures to the distribution of the workforce based on whatever criteria we're looking at, whether it's gender or ethnicity or veteran status. Those are the three things we're trying to do. And we then look at the decision to come forward, whether that's representative of the group or not, and whether there's differences that are worth looking into or not. And then we're looking at, we have a committee process, so the ideas get submitted. Then there's a step where there's a group of people who decide which ideas are worth pursuing, and then it goes to the legal department to make a final vetting. If we have to cull it down even further, we do the next round of culling down, and then we file cases, and then we look at what happens in prosecution. You know, what kind of claims do we get? What quality claims do we get? Just like if you saw David Andrews talking earlier today, he was measuring lots of different things, like the type of claims that you get between different gender, or how much money you spend, or how long, and what's the abandonment rate. So we measure these 4 different milestones. And what we found I believe that each company will have somewhat unique outcomes. You might find that when you go through committee, some weird thing happens, and that might incite you to go back and look at the committee and try to figure out what's going on there. We don't have that. We have our participation issue, and we have a prosecution issue. We know that for ourselves. That's where our data is leading us to understand more. But I think you just need to continually break down whatever process you use to get patents. I would suggest looking at the way that people engage with you, with your team, all the way through to the outcome, whether it's an abandoned case or an issued patent, and break it down into smaller pieces that are measurable and discrete from each other, and try to see whether there's anything in there that jumps out at you. When we did that, we noticed very, very quickly 2 out of 4 were much more interesting for us to follow up on than the other 2. So that's what we do. We have like a funnel we stole from Facebook. Facebook had a great funnel picture. We liked it so much that we just stole it from them, and we used it for our own internal purposes. But that's what we do.
John, you have some great feedback here. So the closing the loop on things, you know, when I put out that article, I figured there'd be a lot of attention to it. And I had a lot of reviewers beforehand that were really represented a lot of areas of folks in the patent space. But if ever there was an oh crap moment for me, it was the day after the article dropped, and I got a LinkedIn message from Andre Iancu. So we had a nice conversation after that, and he actually confirmed that, you know, the data with respect to the PTO was spot on. But one of the things that I've already committed to Joff for next year is to do now that this pledge is out there, call it the accountability phase. So we're working on what that next article is going to look like. And it's very easy for me to pull this for any company that's out there. There's 250,000 patent owners. So I just click a button and I get whatever I want on their diversity stuff. But if there are particular measures, and I'll put this out to the audience, that would be valuable or helpful for showing that progress, I'm all ears, because I'll build that into the article that comes out next June. That said, the easiest things that you can control for, and John, you raised this point, and I appreciate the law firm perspective on this. This is something Elaine Spector at Harity gave me feedback on, is that the folks that sign the ADSs are different than the folks that actually deal a lot with the office actions. Well, I have all their reg numbers. I know every document everybody's signed. That was a level of detail I didn't get into just for space in that folder, but in that original article. But if that's one of those things we could put in the folder and use as a measurement next year to say, well, how are you actually allocating the work within the law firms? Now that's something that we'll be able to get you very specific results, attorney by attorney, case by case, firm by firm, however you want to measure.
I would say, I would suspect that the office action data would be more reflective of what's really happening than the filing data. I worked as a junior associate. I wrote for a couple years applications. I never signed those papers. So I don't believe your signing papers mean anything. They're just meaningless to me. It just does not reflect who is really doing the work. Whereas with office actions, I mean, I also ghost wrote a lot of office action responses that, you know, it's fine. My feelings aren't hurt, but as far as like, what does it tell you? I actually think probably office action data might be more accurate. My own personal opinion is that if you really want to affect change in a law firm, in-house people have to have their relationship partner reflect, you know, sort of a partnership, whatever, it could be more than one person, be a diverse leader, and then that relationship has to be a real relationship, not a cosmetic sort of figurehead position. But, you know, I think your idea of measuring is awesome. So I think the office action activity would be, to me, very interesting to see.
I think the opportunity here, especially for the folks that who are the customer, which is the folks procuring patent services, they have a lot of power here. You saw this with the Washington Redskins. Guy said it'll be a cold day in hell before I ever change the name of that team. And then you had what? 5 advertisers say, that's it, we're done. And they change the name of the team. So it's very easy to move the dollars. You know, you always say hire the firm, not the, or hire the lawyer, not the firm. But I mean, you can get very specific with how you allocate your resources. That's the power that you all have as the major employers of the folks doing the prosecution work. And that's something that you can change tomorrow from my chair. And I agree with you. I think that the office action data is better. We have it, so I know what it says. It's not too different, but I think that there are some very easy things that we can look at that if we come out in June next year and say, well, how are folks progressing? We'll do A/B tests before July 27th, 2020.
So I think we just lost Mike.
Oh, are you guys
21, and yeah, it says.
I think.
Well, actually, so it's just, you know, Mike just gave us a shot here to influence his annual report. What metrics would you like to see? This is your shot. You can ask Mike to report on things that would be valuable for you to help steer resources, to help steer focus. This is your shot. I mean, what would you like to see? And I recognize this is an off-agenda question, so I'm going to give it to John.
So I was going to recommend that if we would do this for you, Mike. I think we would provide stats. I actually think that knowing who filed, what's the filing, is an interesting ultimate question, but it leaves me really wanting to know more about how you got to that decision. And so I would at least be willing to share some data about, you know, the information about the idea submissions, and then you can see the delta between what was submitted and what was filed. I actually think that what was filed, again, it could be that there is some gigantic filtering happening that leads to a result that's unsatisfactory. It could also be that there's low engagement across both whatever measurement you're taking. Like, you know, you might only have 5% of your workforce participating in inventiveness, and then the result could be very different depending on who those 5% are. So I think just knowing a little bit, I would be willing to volunteer some of Lenovo's information to help give you more of a picture about what's happening through the funnel, through the flow. I would love to see other companies do this with us, because I think just us doing it is not going to be helpful for you. But if you got 10, 15 companies to do it, it might make it a little bit more interesting.
So Mike, I mean, one of the things that just Charo just mentioned was, you know, we've got this lag here, right? We have a lag in whatever change we have right now. We have a whole bunch of unpublished patent applications. So even if the problem was fixed literally tomorrow, nobody would know for 3 years. You know, Julie, you're going to have this problem. If you fix the problem, you know, nobody would know.
I would say not true, because I pull 30,000 office or 30,000 serial numbers a day, maybe. So I've got 8-9 million USPTO filings dated this year alone, and there's usually around 40 or 50 million that will come out. So we should be able to see demonstrable differences in the next 12 months, forgetting any of the applications that you start filing tomorrow with a difference. All the ones with expedited prosecution, those are all going to filter to the top. All your track one stuff, all of those things are going to give us more immediate signals that there is a change in behavior. So there's a lot of different ways we'll be able to back into that without having to deal with the 18-month lag. But I mean, it's a real issue. We'll have a better data set 18 months from now, but we'll have enough to be effective in the next year.
I also think looking at this abandonment rate could be an interesting stat to look at, just to see if what David said in an earlier presentation is sort of something that you're seeing as well. I think you will see it. I don't know whether you can evaluate the quality of claims, but I do think this is coming. Eventually in the conversation, we're going to find out, you know, okay, so there are more patents issuing with men than women, but what's the quality of what's coming out? And I don't know if you can do that or not, but that would be another. I think we will all have the ability to assess the quality at a claim level of any portfolio and understand much more clearly what's going on with any company within a couple of years, a year or two. So if you have that ability, that'd be interesting.
So actually, just hang on a second, Mike. So Julie, what thoughts? What would you like to see? This is your shot, Mike. And now, what's the magic number you'd like to see?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've really been looking at seeing, and I think this might be a little harder because you can't pull it from the USPTO data, is some sort of participation or inclusion score. How closely does the inventor population reflect the engineering population? So one of the things we've talked about a lot is, well, I can look and see who signed the papers. And that helps when I think about my own outside counsel. You know, it triggered some thoughts internally. We track who's associated with each case. So even though, I mean, I agree with John, who signs the papers really doesn't always reflect who actually wrote them, but that's something we do track internally. And so we can look at ourselves. I'm really interested in the other thing John mentioned, the metric of what gets submitted into our IDF process and then what gets decided to be filed, which again, doesn't come from USPTO data, that's all internal, but I think that's something that patent professionals in particular, we decide that. When people just submit an IDF, I make the decision, or you know, people on my team make the decision, should we file it or not? And so we can really impact that. And then, you know, the participation metric that I mentioned before, how closely does the inventor population reflect the engineering population? And can we compare, you know, Microsoft is gigantic. We have tons of engineers. And so we can look at it in a group by group level. But again, this isn't something you can get from USPTO data because we don't put on our patent applications, this came from, you know, this from Azure, this came from Office. It's just, this came from Microsoft. And so these are things that we're starting to look at. But for what I would love to get feedback on from, you know, over the next couple of years is which metrics matter, which ones are helpful, which ones do we see a difference in? And I think right now there's tons of different data that are being collected by the USPTO, by IAM, by Lenovo. Like I've seen lots of different ideas for data to collect, but I haven't yet really seen, you know, how to take that data and how it tells you what change to make and how to implement that change. And that's what I'm really hoping we will learn more of in the next year, because you have to start with a baseline. We have our baseline. We've been doing that for about a year now. And it does take a long time. To the question about unpublished applications, you know, even from the day someone submits it to someone files, it can take up to 6 months. And so it can take a long time to filter those changes through the system and see a difference.
Yeah, I think that's actually there is a lag on this. No matter what, if everything was fixed today, we would still be stuck for good data for a while. And then there's, you know, we run into this, that what you just said is making it actionable. How do you turn it into something that is broadly understood and accessible by other stakeholders in the organization? And, you know, so it takes a while for a metric to be an accepted metric too. So even though you might know it's the right metric, now you have to promulgated across the organization, get people to buy in, and then get people to allocate resources because of that, right? And attention. So Jay, one final comment from you, anything you'd like to see, and then we'll head into questions.
To largely echo Julie, I think, and this may be on the operating companies to maybe to collaborate with Mike on this, but some way to indicate that the composition of the invention community, I think would be fantastic. And then also, I think for the companies that have demonstrated success, is some breakdown of like the programs that work the best, and then programs maybe that were tried it and didn't work. So we can start really, connecting the data and sort of the ground truth, what we're seeing with the treatments or the action that we can actually take to affect the change.
Cool. So, Bo, you just said the session can continue for how much time have we got left?
Yeah, so what we have is a parallel breakout session now. So if people would like to leave and go mingle in the breakout session there, they can, but we can stay here for another 15 minutes or so, whichever you like. It's up to you guys.
Well, I'm game for answering some of the additional questions and comments in here. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff. I mean, the one question I guess I have for you, Mike, is your top three of what you'd like to be able to get that's you can't get right now data wise, that companies will be able to supply in some reasonable way to you, that you could actually integrate it and use it, right? I mean, we run into this problem, but if you had sort of three things that would be helpful, what would it be? You're on mute.
I think one of the commenters made the point that how do you tell from the name alone what the actual gender is? Because we're using names and assigning names based on common name at birth, and that doesn't always match. So we have a gap there, a blind spot on that. So that's first thing. And so companies will have to report that data, self-report that data. One thing that would be important, I think the patenting issue is really kind of a lagging indicator to the allocation of resources at the front end. And so it would be really helpful to understand what goes into the funnel before somebody actually makes the decision to pull the trigger on making the patent filing itself. And then I would say the other thing I would like is better ideas, better critical points that we can consider that, folks read this stuff and had a visceral reaction of some form, or they thought it was good or whatever. All of that stuff is helpful because it can allow us to refine and get to a study ultimately that's going to be a lot more credible than what it might seem like on the surface. So if I had to ask for those three things, it would be those three. Give us some more data about how you're actually how folks identify, so we can pick up that underrepresented group. How are you filling your funnel right now, and how does the percentages hold to the patenting decision? And then the last is give us the feedback to improve the measurement.
I think the first ask is very difficult because what I think you're asking is for us to tell you the gender of our inventor community, which is something I won't do, because I think that does, I mean, for me to give gender information about inventors to someone outside the company doesn't feel like something I'm able to do. But the other things you're asking for, I think I can do. And I can even do things like provide at least numerical information that's, here's here's what we filed, and here is how we broke down the split from its, like, let's say, gender perspective. And then you can compare our number, our total number to your total number to see if it's close. I suspect it's going to be very close. I think the tools you're using, we went through a validation on these automated tools to see how accurate they were, and they were very accurate. I think like 90+% accurate. So I doubt that your data is far off.
Yeah, and to your point, John, for the top inventors, we actually validated manually every single person, I think in the top 300 or 500 for the 3 companies that we looked at, just to make sure that, that we weren't seeing something like Apple's number 5 or number 6 inventor is a gentleman from France, but he has a name that all outward appearances is female, but he's actually a gentleman. And we looked it up and literally looked at his photo. I have a link to it in my research work papers. So a lot of this we would be able to discover, if Julie can get me some, API access to LinkedIn, for example, it'd be very easy for me to write a little bit of software and harvest whatever I needed to out of that. But all kidding aside, I mean, I get what you're saying. Some of that data will be discoverable, but a lot of it, I think, to your point, is it's really just to close a gap on an underrepresented group in the study. But I think the overall conclusions of the study will still hold.
One of the questions that was raised, sorry, John, one of the questions that was raised that I think actually is really, how do you get more data on transgender, gender neutral, non-binary inventors? And I think that falls into a group of really hard problems of race, and gender identity, vets. Thoughts on that? I mean, this feels like a really tough HR future problem. Jay?
Yes, super difficult on that. I think for most, I think the right way to account for a lot of these is the self-identification metrics. Really difficult to get, and really difficult to get in a way that can be sufficiently anonymized or aggregated. I think it's hard. I guess if I would make any suggestion, it would be start in the areas that are potentially easier, and that's in no way intending to say ignore these, but my sense is that folks may run into more blocks and challenges at that level of detail that may impede other ability to progress in other areas, because I think it's super hard. Even though I think a lot of companies probably have that information, I think it's just a sort of next level of challenge to get access to that information. Super important information, but very difficult.
Actually, it's a lot. It's not tracked. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Julie.
Oh, I was just saying, one of the things I mentioned before was about like the reflecting of your engineering community. And while we can ask, and we're going to go down the path of, can we ask our inventors to get, to self-identify, and what does that look like? Going and asking every engineer at Microsoft to self-identify so we can compare the populations will probably not result in enough data to actually, like if you get a 20% opt-in to your survey, that's not helpful, right? You don't know what the other 80% of that, even if you have an 80% opt-in, you're missing out on 20%. And with some of these really narrow fields, you're just, underrepresented areas, you're just not going to have enough information to know if your inventive community matches your engineering community or not. And, if you have a couple people opt out for, personal reasons, for, concerns about how the data is being used, all really valid reasons, or just because they don't want to, which is also an incredibly valid reason, your data is not, still has the same problems as using the tools that are publicly available that are going to have, mistakes. Like Mike mentioned, the gentleman from France whose name appears to an American as a woman's name, right? So it's a really hard nut to crack.
So one comment on sort of making sure that the patent departments are sort of being respectful and appropriate towards the transgender and non-binary communities, and just something to flag for folks if they haven't checked this yet, is because patents is a unique area where you have to submit sort of government names to the patent office. There are opportunities for given names to still persist in internal systems that may trigger sort of awards or auto emails to people's managers, even for folks who have subsequently taken on new names. So I would encourage folks to, at the very least, just kind of chat with the folks who are managing their patent systems, and just make sure that they've accounted for and have a solution for the potential for dead naming in those situations, because that's a situation I think everybody would really want to avoid, but not everyone is going to be aware of that potential, especially in the patenting process.
So we have 71,000 employees at Lenovo. 4,000 are in the United States, and the rest are not in the United States. And our HR team is very happy to at least share with us not just gender information, but additional classification information for underrepresented people. But that data is very, very thin outside the United States. So I just think that this challenge will be magnified if your workforce, if your technical workforce is a true international workforce. The problems that Jay and Julie are talking about are very, very real. I actually think there are many times where HR will not even have the information, and they have no way to collect the information, not only on a baseline of who your workforce is, but also the inventors. So it's actually a really, really difficult problem. We have this problem with Lenovo where we also have inventors. We average about between 2 to 3 inventors per application. And in many instances, these inventor communities are not sitting in the same office. They're across the world. And so we have multiple inventors, but how do we count someone if they're a Chinese national in China working with someone in Morrisville? When we file in the US, do we count both or do we count one? How do we do that? It's actually a really hard problem to figure out. So I do think that the challenges on the data, how do you count? How do you count is like where we are as a group. Like we probably know how to get some data. I'd love to see people just come forward and share like what ways that they're trying. And I feel like this is going to be a very long process, and we're going to be iterating on it for a long time. Something that might work for you might not work for my company. And so we might find that there's like 15 ways or 10 ways to measure, and some of them work for you and some of them don't. So the more I do this, the more I realize that this is a huge problem that's going to take a generation to figure out. I think we're on this long haul. So my encouragement to everyone is just to find ways to measure and try to share that with other people, including Mike, and let Mike be inspired by ways to measure. But I'm not expecting there's going to be one way to do this. I think there's going to be lots of ways to do this, and some of them will work and some of them won't for each different company.
So Mike, I actually have a request then for your next paper. Joff loves a good sidebar. And what I'd appreciate, what I think would be really helpful, is to identify sort of what are the top 5 to 10 data problems we have in this industry around getting this information, so that we can check them off. We have every year, we're like, how are we doing on these factors? How are we doing at being able to get a hold of this data and figure out these problems, and which metrics seem to be working, which ones don't? In my mind, that's a thing that would be really helpful to track as you evolve your report. I mean, we do a market report. This is 10 years. We've evolved our metrics to understand the market better for patents. And, I think this is one of those things where you have to identify what some of the problems are that folks have, put it in, do it as a list and say, hey, folks, this is the kind of thing that we're all trying to work on, and add that to the report so that, we have a roadmap going forward.
Well, I'll give you a story. So when I launched this data platform, it was at IPBC in 2013 in Boston. And I mean, it was really an ancillary thing to my main consulting business. But I remember pulling out these dashboards that I had that told a lot of particular things that were not easily available in commercial tools at the time, and many still not. And you know what I was told? I had a big old 43-inch TV right at the front of my booth, and people are like, yeah, don't put that up. Don't put my company up on that thing. I don't want to see it up there. I don't want everybody else seeing it up there. So, I mean, the issue that you have, as far as in my experience, is there's this remarkable perception of value in keeping all of this stuff asymmetric. I mean, you see this with the ownership of patents, but you see it with with license agreements and a variety of things. I think if you could change the mentality that there's, that the information asymmetry is actually a hindrance as opposed to something that's going to further the cause, I think that's going to go a long way, Kent, to opening up.
I think you asked for the holy grail. I just wanted a sidebar of the vote.
I would say,
And
like,
on that note,
I have one more ask.
Okay.
ask. Build a dashboard that lets me put in my company name and get a stat back. Make it build a portal for someone to type in their company name and just get their stats. And I mean, you have the data. It's
Oh, yeah. I did that actually. I put a request out on LinkedIn for folks if they were interested in buying it. And there wasn't enough interest commercially, so I never bothered with it. But I did it last year once I put all the data set in. But yeah, I mean, I could literally tell you, by examiner, by good. Not to, there's actually a lot deeper level of analysis here. You actually see different outcomes based on who your prosecuting attorney is and which inventors they represent and which draw the examiner you get. So, I mean, much more granular than what you'd see out of something like Juristat, because we can actually control for things like name of national origin and things like that. And it's, yeah, it was a flop so far. But if you breathe life into it, hey, I'll take it.
All right.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Appreciate all the questions. It's a great session. Take care.
Thank you. See you guys.
Thanks, everybody, for today. Take care.